Hello and good morning and good afternoon for our East Coast teams. Thank you so much for joining us today for the first Pit Count office hours of this season for the 2025 point in time count. We will get started in about 2 more minutes. We're going to allow for additional folks to get on, to get settled, and then we will get started. So again, thank you all so much for being here to kick off our 2025 point in time count office hours and season, and we will get started in about 1 more minute. Okay, great. If we could go to the next slide, please. We're going to go ahead and get started. I know that there are some folks that are still trickling in. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you all so much for being here and sharing this space with us. So some general housekeeping rules, a recording of today's session along with the slide deck and a copy of the chat and any Q&A content will be posted to the HUD Exchange. Materials from this session, along with the recording and materials from the prior Pit Count office hours sessions, including past years, can be found on the HUD Exchange, and there's a link in the slide deck that you will all also have access to. And to join the webinar via phone, you can use the information on the screen. We can go ahead and plug that into the chat for you as well, in the event that you have access to it and you need to jump onto the webinar by phone. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Please note that we have enabled the chat feature. The Q&A feature is not enabled for this call, but the chat feature is. So if any moment you have a question or you have a comment, please feel free to put it in the chat for us so that we can lift it up and do our best to get you all the answers that you need and that you are requiring. Next slide, please. Please know that closed captioning is also enabled for this event. To hide the captions, click the closed captions button on the lower left-hand side of your screen. Next slide. And just give me a moment to introduce our speakers and our resource advisors. Today we are joined by our friend, leader, and colleague, William Snow with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development SNAP's office, the Office of Special Needs and Assistance Programs. He utilizes he, him pronouns. Here at App Global, you have myself, Shantae White, as I use she, her pronouns. My other colleague, Tanya D'Souza, who also uses she, her pronouns, and our other colleague Sean Morris, who uses he, him pronouns. Next slide, please. So today's agenda, we would like to go over the 2025 Pit Count data collection notice. We're also going to take a little moment to talk a little bit about HDX 2.0 and then have some time at the end of this call for a bit of Q&A. So next slide, please. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our colleague, William, who will take over from here. William?
All right, thanks so much, Shantae. Thanks everyone for joining. Very excited to be able to announce, and hopefully you saw that the Pit Count notice is going to remain the same. We're not making any changes for 2025. You're going to stick to the questions, the HUD required questions that we published for 2024. So that's great. Sorry we couldn't put that out earlier. I think that would have been nice a little earlier, but at least there's no change occurring. Which means hopefully you'll have similar practices as you had in the past, kind of have your rhythm. We're not shaking anything up, and you're able to kind of move forward with what's going on in your communities. We do know that communities are facing all sorts of things. That's kind of a reality all the time, but I feel like we're in a unique situation now. Many communities are coming off of some major disasters and kind of thinking through the impact on their workload, on making sure people are remaining safe and fulfilling all of the fund responsibilities, including the point in time count. Again, this may be a good place to do a reminder. We strongly encourage communities to do a full count, sheltered and unsheltered, every year. But there is a regulatory requirement that it is only required every other year. And again, there are situations where because of, again, the confluence of other things, disasters is a very common thing. If it makes sense in your community and you already counted last year, you may consider that this year. That's just something to bear in mind. But again, we encourage the count where it's feasible, where it can be done safely on an annual basis. We think that's a really important thing. But look at your local circumstances. That's really important. We already know you're overstaffed, doing a lot of work, and the people you're serving are facing some severe needs as well, and they need you to have the space to serve them. So that's our big aspect of this year, is the fact that we're doing nothing different. So we're excited about that. Next slide, please. And I'm going to turn it over to Sean and team to talk through HDX 2.0. I do want to say one thing, though, actually, before I let them speak about HDX 2.0. We know that there were lots of concerns last year. We actually appreciate everyone raising it. I think hearing your voice is important. We love that. That's really critical. We're hopeful we don't face that again this year. We think that was the biggest struggle last year, was just getting through the system and expectations that kind of changed around how am I going to interact? Am I going to get things done? Am I going to see things as I expected it to? We're hoping that those things are resolved this year. Again, crossing our fingers. That's partly why we've asked Sean and some of our app team who work on this to come and speak with you today. But this is something we're watching carefully. A lot of user testing has gone into it, a lot of work to make sure we don't run into that again. We actually did a lot of that before. I don't want people to have the impression that there was no testing, that there was nothing done prior to it being released last time. There actually was quite a bit. But with system transitions, there often are changes that are hard to anticipate. So this is obviously giving us a longer window to try to address that. We can't guarantee that none of that will occur again, but we think the level of testing and the level of kind of interaction on it this time is going to help us to not face those same challenges. And we are really all crossing our fingers that we don't repeat that. So I'm going to turn it now over to Sean and team to talk through that.
Thanks, William. Hey, everybody. Just to underscore William's point, we're doing everything we can to make sure that HDX is working as well as possible. We're definitely focused right now. We can go on to the next slide, Marion. Right now, we're focused on the LSA submission period, which is just open this week. So that site is up and running. The HICPIT and SPM modules you may have seen if you've logged into the system this week are not yet available. Those are undergoing some additional maintenance requirements and some additional testing. So those will be up soon. We're prioritizing putting up the HIC the soonest because we know it'll be useful for a lot of folks who are referring to it for the LSA submission periods. Yeah, and then just as William said, we just want to echo that we are really taking testing very seriously this year. As always, there may well be things that we miss or strange edge cases that have to do with people using old browsers or having specific kinds of file upload issues. And when those things come in, we always love to hear from folks via the AAQ desk. So just in case that comes up for anybody who might be using the system anytime soon, a link to the AAQ desk on the HUD Exchange is at the footer of any page on HUD HDX. So you can just click on it there, and we'd look forward to hearing from you. But otherwise, we're doing everything we can to make sure that the system is functioning just as well as it can and as smoothly for a clean PIT this year. Just because we know that a lot of folks on this call are maybe not in the HDX as much as some folks who might be HMIS leads, for example, some of those people might be here too. If you do have any questions about how the HDX is functioning, we first recommend that you just connect with your HMIS lead if you have the ability. And otherwise, we'd love to hear from you on the AAQ desk. So that's it for HDX updates for now. I'm happy to field any questions if folks have them in the chat. We'll be monitoring that as we continue with the call. And so then with that, we can turn to the next speaker, who is back to Shantae.
Yeah, thank you so much. We already have some questions kind of coming through the chat, and so it might just be helpful to just call them out so folks can um, hear them and kind of hear the response that's been provided. So William, this first one is coming to you. The PIT data collection notice for 2025 is just the 2024 document because there are no changes, correct?
Yep, that is correct. It's a whole process to like make any change to a notice, so we're not changing it. If you read actually in the notice, it essentially says this notice will be in effect until superseded by another notice. So we could actually have this for the next 3 years if we needed to. But there is not a new document that says 2025. It is the one that we posted last year that currently says 2024.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And this next question, I'm going to direct it towards my colleague Tanya. Is there a way to get access to our PIT data? We couldn't do an export from HDX 2.0, so the only way to get my data is from the system, and it's down. I need the data for other grants we're working on.
Hey, thanks, Shantae. Yes, so if you need data from the HDX 2.0 from one of the modules that's down, you can submit an AAQ and just ask directly in the AAQ, can I have my 2024 PIT data? And we'll be able to get you an export of that data, ideally through the AAQ.
And otherwise, we're aiming to have the HIC open most soon, and that is we're aiming for by the end of next week. The PIT will be soon thereafter. So, but yeah, as Tanya mentioned, if anybody has needs for data in the interim, please do submit an AAQ, and look forward to responding that way.
Yeah, and this next question is for Sean. I think you kind of already just said it, but it might just be really helpful. Can you let us know when HUD HDX 2.0 will have the 2024 PIT information available? Again, folks are noticing that it said it's down for maintenance. So if you could just speak on that, that'd be helpful.
Yep, yeah. So just as I mentioned, we're first prioritizing putting the HIC back up by the end of next week, and then we're hoping for the PIT the following week. So just as soon as we can to make sure it's well tested in the interim. Folks may also be interested in PIT summary reports. In last year, just to make sure that we had enough time to actually get the site up, what we prioritized in HDX was giving users the ability to produce raw data outputs, which is useful if you like playing with data, not as useful if you like to have some kind of summary to share with some of your constituents. So that is another priority that we have for this year, is to be able to give users some kind of canned formatted reports with some summary information about the PIT. So that's likely to all be ready much more likely by the time the submission period opens for the PIT this year. So that will be, I lost track of that calendar. I'm not sure that we have usually the same time that it does open most other years. I think that's typically, I don't want to say something and be wrong, but the spring-ish.
That works. Thank you. So this next question, I'm going to turn it back over to William. Other than the HUD required questions for a PIT survey, can we add questions for area data collections?
That's a great question. The short answer is yes. The longer answer is think carefully about it. One of my favorite responses that I've read recently about the PIT count in the context of the competition, because I read all of the responses submitted, I read most of them in HDX about why changes occurred. I read all of them that are submitted in the competition process. And multiple communities actually have observed that when they reduced the number of questions, and they had a larger set based on community asked previously, when they reduced it, their response rate was higher and their completion rate was higher. So people were getting survey fatigue, not completing the survey, and they were missing some questions, some HUD required questions, and many of the local questions. So we would urge you to think very carefully about it, avoid going too far. If I were you, I would not add more than a handful of local questions, but that could be very appropriate. There is so much going on. You're going to need information. This can be a good place for it. if you do that, please work with people with lived experience before putting something in the survey. We did that with our model survey. We actually worked with people with lived experience to kind of test the questions. Do something similar. Make sure that people can understand them and that there appears to be valuable to them and you.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So, William, there's actually two questions that I'm gonna kind of try to connect the threads together, specific about the time period for the pit count. So, for the window of time utilized, could counting occur prior to the night of the count? For example, our count date is Wednesday, and we usually count on Thursday to reflect who was experiencing homelessness the night prior. If we have an outreach team on Wednesday morning, could they ask about where people plan to stay that night? Or does the count have to wait until the night of or after? If we can count ahead of the date, what is the longest window prior to ask where someone anticipates staying? And then the second question is just confirming that shouldn't the count occur within the last 10 days of the month?
Yep, dates is always fun. So you should not count ahead. People can plan where they want to sleep, but that doesn't mean that that is where they will actually sleep. So we ask that the first date reflect the night of your count, like the first night of your count. So if you conduct your count on Wednesday, January 27th, what that means to me is that is the night of January 27th. It is possible that you actually did your count at 2 a.m. on the 28th, but that sleeping period, that night, is really starting on the 27th. So that's what we count. And we ask that you do the same. Again, we've had issues in the past actually with the planning concept. We've run into that. People just don't generally know, or we don't have enough confidence in that. So it needs to be after that. It can be up to 7 days if you're doing an interview-based count. We get that question a lot. We think that's great. It's hard to do with that count in one night. If you have great partnerships and are able to kind of hit areas that are difficult to reach over a couple of days, and then also using service-based approach, right, where you outreach within food banks, libraries, places where people commonly visit, that's a very powerful way to make sure you have a complete number. And we strongly encourage you to do that. But again, it only works if you have an interview-based count so that you can make sure you're not double counting someone. So that's a really critical aspect for it. The last thing to cover is, what does the last 10 days of January mean? For us, that always is in reference to the first night. So you could start your count January 31st and then do that 7-day count afterwards. That's fine. You're still within the last 10 days of January, because you should be asking in that 7-day period, everyone you count, you should still be asking where they slept on January 31st. You'll always have a single date reference point that you should be leaning back on. I'll touch quickly on another one I saw about January 20th or 21st. I would not go earlier than the 21st. If you go earlier, if you do it on the 19th or 20th, send me a request for an exception. You can do that through the HICPIT counts at hud.gov email address. That's in the notice. We try to be as flexible as we can, but we actually have legal requirements that we have to make sure we're not fighting against. So I would just say, to be on the safe side, anything prior to January 21st, you really should just ask for an exception. We give exceptions liberally. We assume that you are doing all you can to find the right night where you'll find the most amount of people. You can do that safely for them, for your volunteers, and be able to have a successful count. So we try to accept all the requests for exceptions.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I'm going to give you a break just for a few moments and kind of turn some questions over to Sean, if that's okay. So Sean, will we be able to manually edit the HIC again? And any updates on that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I'll go ahead. I'll give William a good break, and I've got a couple of questions that we're monitoring here in the chat that I'll go ahead and answer. The first one that Shantae pointed out, are we still expecting users to be able to edit the HIC? Yes, we are this year. That was true last year, and it will continue to be true this year, just because a lot of COCs have a huge benefit of that. So that's been really a key feature. So users will still be able to make edits to the HIC in HDX. The next question is just another vote for PIT summary reports. Thank you for that comment to the person who made that. We, just as I mentioned before, we do intend to have PIT summary reports included this year. They are intended to be simple so that a lot of folks who are data analysts can do more with it. Mostly it'll certainly include the raw data so that folks can have access to that too, but it will include some useful summary reports that folks may have been used to having access to from HTX 1.0 also. We have another question about whether or not users will have the ability to add dates for seasonal beds. My understanding, unless I'm not tracking the question, is that this was an ability given in previous years. So that's with reference to the HIC, and that there's no reason that that wouldn't still continue to be the case this year. The user who's asking this question may have had in mind some hiccups that we had with, in some cases, with seasonal bed beginning and end dates, but we anticipate dealing with those too. And the last of the 4 questions I was going to field just again had to do with HTX performance and sometimes load times. This is another thing that we're testing. It was especially difficult for some users, particularly for the HIC who had really large data sets. In some cases, they had to wait a really long time while their data sets were processed. This is something we've already done some load testing with some really promising results. So that's great too. And we're doing some additional smoke and end-to-end tests for other users who are making spot edits, just like they would for the HIC and PIT. So we are taking testing really seriously and continue to do so. We want to make sure this website works as smoothly as possible for everybody. So that's my slew of responses there. I'll go ahead and hand it back to Shantae.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sean, and I reserve the right to ask you more questions.
Sure.
So the next question that's popping up, I believe this is going to be aimed at William, and maybe Tanya and Sean will also want to chime in. Is it correct that the unaccompanied youth subset and parenting youth subset are mutually exclusive?
That is a great question. Yes, they are supposed to be mutually exclusive. There are some gray areas that you have to negotiate with how you will report someone locally. So the most common example is if you have a parenting youth, as in it is a parent who falls in that age group and they have a child, but that child is not with them, you have a decision to make. Are they presenting and seeking services on their own, i.e. as unaccompanied? If so, it probably is most appropriate to report them as unaccompanied, and if that status changes, to update it to parenting youth. However, that's not always clear, right? They could be in the process of, if maybe their child was with a grandparent and they know that they're going to connect in the next few weeks. It's a little uncertain when exactly, but it's pretty certain it's going to happen. Again, those are the areas we trust your discretion on that. If you feel like it is most appropriate to report them as a parenting youth with the expectation that they will be served with services that address the parenting aspect in particular, absolutely report them as parenting youth. So we leave that in your hands to kind of figure out. But generally, that's like the main area that causes some confusion. But otherwise, there should be, those categories should not overlap.
That's helpful. Thank you so much. And I think there is a couple of other questions really connected to conducting the actual count. So when it comes to recruiting volunteers who are not professionals in our industry, even though training of volunteers, even though there's thorough training of volunteers, what are some tips HUD can provide when it comes to the safety and the liability issues? And William, if you don't mind, I would more than happily help answer this. So the first thing that comes to safety and liability issues is just making sure that you're not sending volunteers out alone. It's always best to pair your volunteers with folks who consistently and already work within the system and do a lot of this work. Not to say that you may or may not have outreach teams available, but it's always helpful to pair volunteers with people who have actively engaged with populations and with the community and have done a little bit of street outreach as well as interview work. Also, just kind of think about, your community best. You know what areas are safe and not safe, and let's not send people or volunteers into areas that we know are not physically safe. Making sure that folks have access and know of safety hotlines, know how to be able to reach any of our wonderful people that work as first responders, anything of the sort, and to not engage in situations just for the sake of conducting the count. If they approach a situation and it seems that there's active safety concerns happening right before them, do not engage. Make sure that we are making sure that people are feeling safe, that people are also feeling empowered to make that own judgment decision for themselves, and just to notify people around them that, hey, I came across this area, it was not safe, we didn't get it done, and that's okay. William, I'm not sure if there was anything else that you would like to tack onto that.
That was fantastic. The only other thing I would add was safety is a principal perception. Shantae went over that really well, right? Like it's the perception of the people counting. It's also the perception of people being counted. We care about both sides of that equation. So if there's something where somebody expresses that they don't feel safe, there's no questioning at that point. That like it's done. They don't feel safe. We believe them. You'll work with your COC or as COC leads or count leads, you'll need to figure out how to take in those circumstances. So if you leave a situation because you feel it was unsafe or people expressed concerns about safety, it is good still to get a head count if possible, or to find some way to do an observation. I will still raise the caveat that that still has a layer of safety. Like if you are afraid something is going to happen immediately, there you are out. We make sure that that safety comes first, but often you kind of get a little bit of a warning. You can quickly gauge kind of at least how many people are there and move away. So just add that to your list of things to consider. It's very common for communities to have an observation kind of backup. It tends to be a small part of many communities' counts just because they can't literally interview everyone for a variety of reasons. That's okay. And that's actually a good, safe approach.
Yeah, thank you. We had another question come in asking if there's been any updates to the extrapolation tool, and is it available for use now? To answer, there have been no updates for this year, as there are no changes in data collection to the extrapolation tool. That tool from the 2024 pit count still remains and is available for use right now. There was a question that just came in the chat that could be really helpful that says, if my shelter count is unchanged from last year, can I use last year's data so I can focus on getting a good unsheltered count?
The short answer is no. You still need to do the sheltered count, although most people are at this point are using, I think we see something like 80% of COCs or at least using HMIS for part of their count. If you're uploading your data, say, well, for the HIC module, that's a good start. But hopefully you can actually run the data primarily through your HMIS side. If you're not doing that and you weren't sure if that's a possibility or allowed, let me be clear. That's a fantastic starting point. Please don't reinvent the wheel. You have an HMIS. This is a good reason to use the HMIS. Don't go and count, physically count in facilities where you should have the data already, not from last year, but from this year's data that you've been collecting through HMIS. Your victim service providers should be using comparable databases. We do not ask for a roster. We do not ask for data from them at the client level, but you certainly can ask for aggregate data from them. They also are able to answer those questions for you, probably using their comparable database. If you say, hey, you could just ask them, you had 20 last year with all this same data, has anything changed? That's actually okay. That's different than just copying numbers from last year, but that is okay. So use your economies of scale, use your benefits from last year, reach out to people. If you know things have not changed, just verify. But again, leverage HMIS as much as possible to avoid you having to redo stuff that may actually or should be available in HMIS already.
Yeah, we have another question. Does HUD have any specific recommendations or best practices for conducting the January pit for communities who have been severely impacted by Hurricanes Helene and Milton? We want to assure an accurate count while addressing constraints. And William, I think that this question is for you, and I think it might also be a great time to kind of talk about when our communities on the East Coast specifically encounter a lot of the migrant populations as well.
Yeah, it's a really good question. The disaster context is difficult. This is where we would strongly urge you to start with, if you did a count last year, and I'll look at Florida for a moment, every COC in Florida counted last year except for one. So you can start with the question, COC, does it make sense for us to do a count, an unsheltered count, I should be clear, an unsheltered count in 2025? Start with that question. Don't assume that you must do it. Start with the, does it make sense to do it? Can we do it safely? If you do think you can do it safely, then you get to like, okay, how do I do it accurately then? Most of the time, that's leveraging vehicles you used in the past for your population that you normally engage with. For your disaster population, that tends to be very different. What we often see is coordination with Red Cross. Red Cross is generally a good partner with sharing basic information. We know that that data tends to have a lot more that needs to be extrapolated for. That's okay. Like, it's a disaster setting. We get it. We are totally okay with that. Take what you can get, use what you can. When you do an extrapolation for that population, I would do it again for that population. If you have just a little bit of data for people who are displaced by a disaster, use that as your sample, because that's probably a more accurate sample than using your general homeless population that you serve outside of a disaster context. So that's really important for you to start there. Similar concepts actually apply to if there are new arrivals tied to either immigration or refugee. We actually found a lot of communities reported over the past 2 years seeing new arrivals. You're going to have to kind of think through, how are they showing up in your system? The expectation is that you would count them. I mean, that's kind of the first starting point, is, do we count them? And the answer is yes. If they otherwise meet the homeless definition, then they meet the homeless definition. But think through, where are they showing up? Are they in a general shelter system? Are you able to kind of understand what's going on there? Many communities actually have put up a new kind of shelter system specifically addressing our new arrivals tied to immigration or who are refugees. You'll just have to consider how to include that in your data. But if they meet the homeless definition, we ask that you do that. I'm going to revert back to the disaster piece for just a moment. If you're going to move forward with a full count, even if you just do the sheltered count, it is really critical that you make sure you're identifying them. Any shelter that is tied to the disaster only as disaster shelters, there's a space to do that. We actually remove that in our competitive process. Like, we don't count that population towards your normal homeless population when looking for change over time. That is how we've done it for several years in our competition. We get disasters add more people, and they're probably not your normal population that you're serving. So I can only know who that is if you indicate that in your HIC, and then we back the numbers out based on the projects that you report there. But we absolutely do that. It's really important for us to do that, and it's important for you to tell us about it.
That's really helpful. I'm going to try and give you a little bit of a break and answer some of the questions that I think that I can speak to, and then we'll get back to more in-depth questions. So one of the other questions that came in was, how do other communities organize their encampment counts, and how they plan for known locations with outreach workers? So what I've seen in some of the technical assistance that I've been able to provide to some communities, and just context of local knowledge, is that communities will rely on their outreach teams and outreach leads to really help them identify and pinpoint the areas of which they know folks are experiencing homelessness. Some communities have data that they're able to rely on to know where known locations of encampments currently exist, and we'll revisit those specifically for the point in time count. I believe I also saw another question in here from law enforcement asking about how to include law enforcement in the PIT count. One of the things, and I know William will also speak to this, is sometimes in communities, unfortunately, sweeps will happen at the same time as the PIT count. So it might change the data and folks might get moved around. There have been some success in some communities for them to partner with law enforcement in a way that is not harmful and in a way that it actually invites and encourages conversation to help folks get interviewed to figure out where it is that they have been sleeping, were sleeping, and what kind of how they're choosing to identify within our system, right? There has been some success in doing that. When you're trying to work with your local community, include your hospitals, law enforcement, education system, things like that. All community partners is an all hands on deck, because some of the systems might have better knowledge of how to contact or communicate with folks or be able to identify the very populations that they are working to serve. So we just encourage you to really expand that outreach to community partners, to really have an all hands on deck to be able to work together in coordination and partnership, and recognizing that we are for a common goal, and not there to criminalize, not there to exacerbate problems or anything of the sort. We are truly there to figure out what is going on with folks in our community in the moment that we contact them. William, I'm not sure if you had anything else to add on to that.
That was great. Really important, especially about law enforcement. Again, law enforcement can be your best partner and they can be your worst partner. You're going to have to know your local context. There is a new layer to this now. Some communities are facing situations where there are now laws in place that make it unclear what a PID count even looks like. So you're going to have to start with these kind of layers. First, decide if it's safe for you to conduct that count this year. Again, most communities counted last year. This may be a year where you pause a moment and think about, what should this look like? I'm sure many of you have already done that thinking. Some of you have probably decided, we feel confident and we're going to move forward. That's great. That is fantastic. If you are not confident and you are unclear what this should look like from the standpoint of how will this impact the people we're serving, but you want to count, right? Because there's kind of a double-edged sword here. If you don't count, you don't know what's going on. If you do count, you're not sure you're going to find anyone. So if you decide not to count, again, unsheltered count, and wait a year to kind of let things settle a little bit, that's okay if you conducted an unsheltered count last year. If you want to proceed with a count, you may actually change your methodology. It may be wise to take more of an observation-based count approach in this situation, right? Where you are not collecting data on people who are sleeping outside, because you don't know if it will be FOIA'd or if that will be, if people will request that. If you are unsure what to do there, again, you can just move to an observation-based count. It means you'll need to still do some kind of sampling. Usually people use their street outreach teams to do that. Kind of within the 7-day period is pretty typical. But I'm putting that out there because it is something we have thought a lot about. We have concerns about, and we know this weighs heavy on you who are already dealing with a lot of things on your plate. So take that into consideration. We are very understanding of the realities that are happening, and recognize that that will flow into things like your point-in-time count.
Thank you. That's helpful. And you said a term that I think is going to tie nicely into these next couple of questions, specific to the observation count. I think that these are some really great questions that kind of came in. There's 3 separate ones, so we'll tie them into one. If we could just talk about, what does it mean to conduct an observation count, and how, the best way, would you expect a community to report these data in their full count, or reserve it for local use and reporting?
That's a good question. So let's back up a little bit to what's allowed, right? Because observation actually was the traditional form of PID counts early on. Most people did an observation-based count. We also refer to them as blitz counts, where you literally have your night, you go out with teams, you see people. Usually you have a street outreach worker who kind of knows who's out there. You identify them, you bring that total head count back, and then you also conduct a sample, usually again using a street outreach team of the unsheltered population you engage with, and you extrapolate accordingly. That could very well be done here. There's a modified version of that where you do some sampling while you're out there. The most accurate version of that is doing a random sample, right? You're not picking who you're going to who you're going to ask to interview ahead of time, or just when you see them. It's more like I'm going to interview every third person. That's what a random sample would look like. That's not always possible either. So some people actually go with more of a known count where they kind of know some folks and they'll ask accordingly. You have to be wary of bias in that case. That's a reality. So that's the one layer that I'll put on there, but that is acceptable. We have pushed folks more towards an interview-based count. I think more have gone there, partly because the level of data collection that's required now is more intense than the early years. Demographics, we don't think you actually can accurately find out someone's gender by just looking at them. Those assumptions are not safe. That applies to race and ethnicity as well. Certainly applies to veteran status, right? So these are things that are hard to know without actually asking people. We love seeing the push towards interview-based. We think that tends to be more accurate. That doesn't mean there's not a space for sampling. It doesn't mean you have to count every person. That's actually almost impossible. So sampling is actually safe and a good way to go. But again, if it is not safe or you are unclear how to count in a current environment that you're in, observation is fine. As I stated, take that approach where you have known teams, or at least a leader on a team who has knowledge of what it's like to interact with folks on the street. They're your street outreach teams, and be able to help support an observation-based count where you're literally seeing people, counting accordingly, and then conducting after that initial night, conducting your sample. If you do an observation-based, that's going to be one night. There are very few exceptions to that. We have had a few areas where like they are so geographically dispersed. They are very large areas and there is no mixing between people who are 5 hours away. Yeah, that's fine. We tend to say that's okay. But otherwise, you generally need to be doing it all on one night. I'm going to put this into another question I saw about like, do we count at nighttime? Do we count at daytime? It's a good question. Nighttime is preferable. That's obviously when people are sleeping. It's also when you're more likely to find people. The daytime, you're going to find probably a select group of folks, maybe folks you're used to interacting with. Typically, we see the street outreach teams, again, leading out or being a key role in the counts as they're conducted at night. We strongly encourage you to move that way. If you can't, and you absolutely have no opportunity to count at nights, can you count in the daytime? Yes, it's not ideal. If you do it, you must do a survey. And yes, I would strongly encourage you to do that over multiple days, because I do not think you're going to find everybody in a single day if you're just kind of going through the daytime hours or even evening hours. So you need to actually put in more provisions to make sure your outreach is more robust. But again, we discourage that just because there is a lot more veracity to being out among folks who are actually sleeping and being engaged in the process that way.
Thank you. That's really helpful. You kind of hit a couple questions with that answer specific to the observation counts of when they should be conducted, as well as the time of day of when folks should be counted. So another question that came in, sorry, I lost my space. Oh, here we are. In our last year's count, there were instances where some faith-based organizations opened doors to act as warming shelters on count night for unsheltered individuals. No beds were provided in these instances for anyone to lie down. People were allowed to stand or sit inside the building to remain warm. Would it be appropriate to count these individuals in the unsheltered account, given that they are not in a facility specified for human habitation since there were no beds?
Good question. We get a lot of variations on what's sheltered versus unsheltered. This is an example that we would count as unsheltered. No bed, that's not a facility where people are going to be sleeping for the night. They may be escaping the elements, which is good. That is definitely a positive move. So we don't discourage that activity from happening. We just don't count it as sheltered.
Thank you so much. There was another question about clarifying question on what qualifies as a disaster shelter. If our community has set up a shelter specifically for migrants and leveraging FEMA dollars, should that site be considered a disaster shelter?
Oh, that's a good question. So typically if it's FEMA funded and it's addressing people who are displaced, that almost always gets counted. I can't think of a scenario where we haven't counted that, but there are situations where we've seen communities create very temporary shelter spaces with the intent that they will take them down again. They may be like a community rec space or something like that. It is intended to address a disaster situation. We see this often with schools, actually. That is okay to count. There's going to be like a million gradations between there and a normal shelter. You can use your discretion. What I would typically start with is, who am I serving? Do I expect that when they leave this project, they are likely to return to a house situation or a situation where they find assistance as a result of disaster assistance or disaster funding? If so, then yeah, I'd probably count that as disaster. If you feel like the population probably is not reflective of your larger displaced population, you're probably going to serve them longer even. It's probably not so temporary. I mean, you're going to have to use some discretion. I probably would start to look at that as, that's probably not a disaster site. That's probably going to be working on a more long-term basis. Again, there's some wiggle room there. So you have some discretion as COCs. We trust you. We're happy to answer questions that you send to us. But also, again, we really do trust you. Like you're very smart. You have a ton of things that you're doing, and you do this all the time. If it feels like it's the people you serve on a normal basis, yeah, it's probably in your normal shelter system. It feels like it's a different group tied to, again, a specific circumstance that's probably going to end. All right, that's probably where you should be thinking about them in terms of reporting.
Thank you so much. So one of the next questions I think is based in, if we could talk a little bit about conducting interviews by phone.
Is there something specific in there about like what they're hoping to do over the phone?
No, the example was outreach staff calling people they know to be staying in places not meant for human habitation and completing the survey over the phone, particularly following up with people in the 7-day window that were not seen or counted on the first day. And I think just talking about what is and what is not within bounds when we're counting folks over the phone.
That's great. Okay. Yep, can do that. I'm going to expand this to phone and web because we've actually seen this as well. So using the phone when you're interacting with somebody who you know is experiencing homelessness, you are not sure if they were experiencing homelessness on the night of the count, but you know that you had interactions with them in a homeless experience recently. You absolutely can outreach to them. Street outreach teams are fantastic. In fact, their data is probably in HMIS, so they don't need to like fill out a survey. It can be, Azim from the street outreach team reaching out and saying, hey, Joe, haven't heard from you in a while. Hope you're well. Checking up to see where you were last night, right? If last night was a pit count. It could be that simple. If that response is, hey, I was in this location, you know it to be unsheltered, that's enough. You take their HMIS record, you include them, you're good to go. We think that's great. That's a good use of your time. It's a good way to make sure that your count is as comprehensive as possible. This also applies in the context of coordinated entry. If you have a coordinated entry center that's receiving calls the night of the count, which probably all of you do, and they call in, they express that they have no place to stay that night, they are seeking assistance, it is okay to count them. I would just be careful because if you actually place them into shelter, you want to make sure you're not double counting them, right? But you should be able to deduplicate at that point anyways. So deduplication is really key there, but that's okay. What we don't want is like a general phone line. Count in if you're homeless on the night of the count. We've actually seen that years ago. It did not go well. Like it was impossible to validate anything. It was clear there were people coming in multiple times. There were some weird circumstances. So we just say no to that. That's actually why we don't do a web page as well that says do the same thing, right? Come here, tell me if you're homeless tonight. If you want to use that for local purposes, there may be great value to it, right? Like we don't want to discourage that, but I would not include that in the point in time count. There's not enough to validate that you're aware that the people reaching out through those very public and kind of uncontrolled mechanisms are experiencing homelessness per the kind of very narrow parameters that we do in the point in time count. Shante, anything I missed on that one?
No, I think that was pretty great. And if folks have more questions about phone specific counting and coordinated entry, please let us know in the chat. We're happy to take in those questions and make sure we continue to answer them. One of the other questions that came in was asking if it's better to count on the night, should we waking people up to conduct an interview? My respectful short answer, please don't. That's just out of the respect of humans and folks who are unfortunately street sleeping at this time, that we should not wake them up. It is okay to conduct an observation pool at that time.
Yeah, it's a great question, one that comes up every year because we do the count during these crazy hours, right? So this is where using the street outreach team and setting your hours for the count both matter. Because if your street outreach team knows folks, I've done several counts. I try to count every single year, and I'm usually with a street outreach worker. In almost every circumstance, they're like, oh, there's Emily. There's Jad. There's right, like they know who they are. We don't need to wake them up. We already got it. We're not saying an interview is like the thing that makes it golden. We're saying knowing who they are is actually a key part of it. There are certainly situations where you don't know who they are. And again, this is where it's important to think through those hours. If you're doing early morning hours, like 2 a.m, that would be rough to wake someone up. Once you get closer to 6 or 7, I have to admit, I don't want to be woken up at that time. But that might be, in the context of the pick count, that might be more acceptable. Think through with your street outreach team. Is that safe? Is that wise? This is why a lot of COCs actually count. They start their count between 10 and midnight. It's actually not uncommon to see people moving around in those hours and starting to settle and feeling comfortable asking them as they start to get settled. But once you hit the like 1 a.m., that's tough, right? Like that tends to be a hard one. But again, we trust that you as COCs kind of understand the context you're working in and are going to do that in a safe way that's respectful to the people that you're identifying.
Thank you. I think we have time for about like 1 or 2 more questions. And this question is actually in reference to the HIC, which I think might be helpful for some folks. So we might, William, also get the help from Tanya and Sean on this one too, tag team effort. So with shared housing, if 2 different program subsidies are used in the same unit, for example, a state ESG referee housing and a city ESG referee housing, should we only report 1 unit on the HIC? And if so, which program is the unit counted in?
That is a good question. So the short answer is 1 unit. 1 unit and every unit. But that is the hard part because there are plenty of projects that overlap and you don't necessarily know which one. So figuring that out, setting up HMIS in a way to reflect the unique bed at least once. Which one you choose to reflect is up to you. Let's say you have a facility where it is emergency shelter and it is getting both county and state funding from ESG. There's nothing to stop you from picking one that has every bed in it and every person in those beds. And then in the ESG funding line item, you're just going to put ESG. You can choose to put more information about the funding sources being both. We're not actually looking for you to identify that. So that's a layer that's interesting, not important to us at HUD, but may be important to you locally. So you may want to adjust your naming convention even to reflect what's going on there just for the purposes of the HIC. But that's kind of where I would start is a lot of it. I think people think we look more at some of these more nuanced pieces on funding. We know there's a lot of braided fundings. We encourage that, which makes a little bit of a nightmare sometimes when you're trying to say exactly which beds are associated with what. Click all the funding sources that apply. That's how we kind of look at it, and we can kind of think through that. I'll defer to Tanya and Sean if they have more that they would add as well.
Thanks, William. No, I agree with all of that. The only thing that is if you do have them as 2 separate entries in your HMIS, just be sure to delete the record that pulls in from your HMIS for one of the whichever one you prefer, so that you aren't double counting that unit twice.
Super helpful. And we've got about 5 minutes left, and I think we could wrap it up with this one last question that I can go ahead and take on, and then any additional support or ideas coming from William and the team I think could be helpful for this person. If you're new to the role of leading a PIT across a large state, what are key pieces of advice you would know in preparing for that effort? One, lean into your community. Your community knows its community. They know the locations, they know the people, the services, the resources, all of those things. Lean into that. We would also just encourage you to continue to build those community partnerships and open those conversations and invite maybe community partners that have historically have not participated, invite them to continue to participate, so they can kind of get an experience of what folks are kind of really going through out there, how people are really experiencing homelessness and what that looks like. We also encourage you to continue to use the resources on the HUD Exchange through the PIT and HIC webpage that we will also make sure that it's listed in the chat for you once again. And if you have specific policy questions or you're just hitting a sticking point, you're not sure the answer, feel free to email the HICPIT.count.gov email and ask your questions away. Submit questions to the AAQ. You have resources and community partners as well as us in order to be able to help support you and answer those questions. William, would you add anything to that?
That was a really good response. I would say another resource are your peer COCs. So there are lots of balance of state COCs, lots of statewide COCs, and lots of regional COCs. If you think you got to create all of this on your own, like that's so much work. It's a ton. And I work with a lot of balance of states and statewide. They're very happy to share where possible. So I would say look at your closest partner, or that could be proximity, or it could be like they look similar to my kind of makeup, and reach out to that COC and see if they're willing to share some tips on how did you manage to cover a large geography? How did you deal with all the ins and outs? But absolutely leverage your peer partners. They're fantastic and could be very helpful.
Yes, and thank you so much. So I know that there are quite a few more questions in the chat that we weren't able to answer today, and that's okay. We're going to try and make sure that we get answers out to folks, especially when they're policy related, and making sure that you're understanding the requirements and expectations of the annual point time count. Please note that we also are going to have another call in December. Yes, sorry. What is time? In December. Please join us for that call. Be on the lookout for those listservs, the emails, and things like that. We will continue this conversation, continue to ask your questions, whether it's out loud here in the chat, or we can try and send some follow-up frequently asked question documents to kind of just help folks make sure that they feel supported and have all the information they need to be able to conduct a successful count in their community. As always, we thank you so much for being here. And William, do you have any parting words for our communities and attendees today?
Just thank you to all of you for all that work that you do. It's amazing. We appreciate it. And that's it. So thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. We appreciate you, and we will talk soon and see you all next month. Take care.